The gun was already pressed against Phineas Warren's temple when Julia Barrett stepped onto her porch and screamed his name. She had not screamed for any man in 4 years. Not since her husband Thomas had died in a ditch 3 miles outside of Redemption, Texas, face down in clay-red mud, with a bullet in his back that everyone in town pretended not to know the origin of. She had sealed herself up after that, sealed the house, sealed her heart, sealed even the windows against the dust and the noise and the wanting. She had become a woman of routine and silence and deliberate, aching aloneness. And now she was screaming. "Let him go," she said, and her voice was not shaking, which surprised her most of all. "You let him go right now, or I will put a hole through every last one of you." She had the Winchester already up, the same rifle she used on coyotes that got into her chicken yard, the same rifle she had cleaned every Sunday for 4 years because keeping it clean was a kind of prayer, a kind of promise to herself that she would survive whatever this territory decided to throw at her next. There were 3 of them. 3 men on horseback in the pool of lamplight that spilled from her porch lantern, and in the middle of their loose, predatory circle was Phineas Warren, his hands bound behind him, a pistol barrel pressed hard against the side of his head by a man whose face was half hidden under the brim of a black hat. Phineas was looking at her, not at the gun, not at the men who held him. He was looking straight at Julia Barrett with those storm-gray eyes of his, and there was something in his expression that she would spend months trying to name afterward. Not fear, something older than fear. Something that looked almost like relief, like a man who had been running so long he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone run toward him. "Ma'am," said the man with the black hat, and his voice was oily and pleased with itself, the voice of a man who enjoyed having leverage. "This is between us and the drifter. You do well to take yourself back inside." "This is my land," Julia said, "and that is my porch light you are standing in, so I will decide who stays and who goes." She would think about that moment for a long time afterward, the porch light, the way it had pulled him in, because it had started 5 nights ago, and it had started with nothing more than a lamp. Redemption, Texas in the autumn of 1882 was a town that had outlasted its own optimism. It had been named by settlers who believed the land itself could absolve a person of whatever they had left behind, and for a generation that had worked, more or less. People came, they built, they planted. A church went up, then a schoolhouse, then a saloon which did considerably more business than the church, but that was the nature of things on the frontier. The railroad had been talked about for years, promises made at town meetings by men in suits who smelled of Eastern money and Western ambition, and for years those promises had been enough to keep the community bound together in shared expectation. Then the railroad went 30 miles north, through a different valley, following easier terrain, and the financial interests of men whose names nobody in Redemption would ever know. After that the slow bleeding out began, the kind that does not kill a town quickly, but simply drains it of its youngest and most ambitious until only the stubborn ones remain. Julia Barrett was among the stubbornest. She had come to Redemption as a bride, 19 years old and wide-eyed, and in love with a man named Thomas Barrett who had a gift for making everything sound possible. Thomas had broad shoulders and a contagious laugh, and a fatal blindness to the difference between men he could trust and men who merely seemed trustworthy. He had borrowed money to expand the farm, borrowed from men who had no interest in repayment schedules and every interest in acquiring land. When Thomas died on that road, the death was ruled a robbery gone wrong by a sheriff who Julia strongly suspected had been paid to rule it exactly that way. She had been 26 then. She was 30 now, and she had held the farm together through sheer mechanical will, rising before dawn, working until her hands bled, keeping meticulous accounts in a ledger that Thomas had never bothered to open because numbers bored him, and because he had trusted people he should not have trusted. The farm was 140 acres of good bottomland, a creek running through the eastern quarter, a house she had repaired and expanded herself with help from her neighbor Me Coulter and Me's 2 grown sons. She kept 12 cattle, 40 chickens, a kitchen garden, and a horse named Franklin who was 17 years old and opinionated about everything. She kept a porch lantern burning from dusk to about 9 in the evening every night, and this was a habit she had begun in the weeks after Thomas died for reasons she never fully articulated even to herself. It was partly practical, because the road ran close to the house, and a light helped her see who was passing. It was partly something else, something she might have called hope if she were the type of woman who allowed herself that word, which she was not anymore, not after everything. But the lamp burned and the road ran past her land, and in a town that was slowly emptying out, drifters came through with some regularity, men heading west or heading north or simply heading, the way certain men do, without a fixed destination, moving because stillness had become impossible for them. Phineas Warren had been one of those men. He had been passing through Redemption on the road that ran past Julia's land for at least 5 years, that much she knew. Not continuously, not as a resident, but as a ghost who moved on a schedule she had come to dimly recognize the way you recognize a recurring weather pattern. Spring and fall, sometimes winter, rarely summer, a rider on a dark horse at a distance, following the road north or south with the kind of unhurried but purposeful movement of a man who lived entirely in the traveling and never in the arriving. She had noticed him first in the spring of 1879, when she was mending a fence along the road, and a stranger on a big gray roan had slowed his horse briefly, touched the brim of his hat in her direction, and then ridden on without a word. There was nothing remarkable about it. Men passed through all the time. But she had noticed the quality of stillness in him even in motion, the way he held himself in the saddle like a man who had grown up on horses, and she had watched him until he went out of sight around the bend, and then she had gone back to her fence and not thought about it for weeks. She saw him again that autumn, going the other direction, and the spring after that, and the autumn after that. Always the same gray roan, always the same unhurried pace, always the same brief acknowledgement of the farm's existence without stopping. He never stopped, not once in 5 years of passing. She had mentioned him once to Me Coulter, who had been in Redemption longer than anyone and knew or had opinions about everyone within 50 miles. Me had gone still and thoughtful in a way that meant she was sorting through information she was not sure she wanted to share. "That'll be Phineas Warren," Me had said finally. "He comes through now and then. Was a lawman once, I heard. Deputy up in Abilene back in the 70s before things went wrong there." "Wrong how?" Julia had asked. "Oh, there's different stories," Me had said, which was her way of saying she knew something specific but was choosing to be diplomatic about it. "He was involved in something. Some kind of betrayal, people say. Not his betrayal, mind you. He was on the receiving end of it. After that, he just kind of drifted." Julia had filed that information away with the careful neutrality she applied to all information about people she was unlikely to know well, and she had not thought about Phineas Warren very much again until the 5th of October, 1882, when the autumn evening was cooling fast and she was sitting on her porch after supper, watching the last of the light leave the sky, and a rider came along the road moving north, moving at that same steady pace she had come to recognize over years of half-attention. She did not know what made her look up from the mending in her lap. She did not know why, on this particular evening among all the hundreds of evenings she had sat on this porch, her eyes found that rider and held. Maybe it was the quality of the light, the way the lantern made a small warm circle in the gathering dark. Maybe it was something about the way the horse was moving, a subtle irregularity in the gait, something not quite right. Or maybe it was just time. Maybe some things simply happen when enough time has passed, and the conditions are finally exactly what they need to be. The rider slowed. He slowed to a walk and then he stopped, sitting his horse at the edge of the lamplight's reach, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Julia set her mending down in her lap and watched him. He was looking at the light. Then he was looking at her. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply waited the way the land itself waits, patient and without expectation. And after a moment that stretched itself out longer than ordinary moments do, Phineas Warren turned his horse off the road and came toward her porch. "Evening," he said, pulling up about 10 feet from the steps. Up close, he was different than she had imagined. Not rougher exactly, more worn. Like something that had been good quality to begin with and had been used hard, used longer than it was perhaps designed to be used, but had held its fundamental integrity through all of it. He was maybe 34, 35, with a face that had seen too much weather and not enough sleep, gray eyes under dark brows, a jaw that needed a razor, and hands on the reins that were still and capable. "Evening," she said back. "Your horse has a loose shoe," he said. "Left foreleg." She looked at Franklin, who was tied at the post by the barn. Even from here she could see it, now that he had pointed to it, the slightly off angle of the hoof when Franklin shifted his weight. "I see it," she said. "Thank you. Long way to the next farrier," he said. "I know," she said. "I have the tools, I'll manage." He looked at her steadily. "You need a hand with it." She considered him. She considered herself. She considered the lamp burning on the porch hook behind her head and the darkness of the road and the 4 years of managing alone and the complete and absolute impracticality of saying yes to a stranger just because something about him made the evening feel less quiet. "Might as well get down," she said. "I'm Julia Barrett." "Phineas Warren," he said, and he dismounted with the economical ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and something shifted in the evening air. Something quiet and irrevocable, like the moment when a window that has been painted shut finally opens. He fixed Franklin's shoe. It took him 20 minutes and he was competent and quiet about it. And when he was done, she had already brought out a pot of coffee and 2 cups because she was a practical woman who saw no reason to be inhospitable. He sat on the lower step, and she sat in her chair and they drank coffee, and talked in the specific way of people who are not quite sure how much honesty to allow, but find themselves allowing more than they planned. He did not volunteer information about himself beyond his name and a general sense that he traveled widely and worked where work presented itself. She did not press. She told him about the farm, about the cattle, about the creek and the kitchen garden and the coming winter. She told him, without particular emotion, that her husband had died 4 years prior and she was managing the farm herself. He said he was sorry for her loss. She thanked him. He asked if she had family nearby and she said no, that her parents had passed and she had a sister in Missouri she wrote letters to but had not seen in 3 years. He nodded as if he understood the particular shape of that kind of distance. The lamp burned. The night insects made their noise. Franklin stood in his repaired contentment and occasionally blew air through his nose in a meditative way. "You've passed this road before," she said. Not accusatory, observational. He looked at his coffee cup. "Several times," he said. "I know," she said. "I've seen you." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you have," he said, and there was something almost careful in his voice, something that acknowledged more than the words themselves said. "Why'd you stop tonight?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He did not give her a quick answer. He gave her the truth, or what seemed like the truth, which was that he did not entirely know, except that the light had looked like something he could not quite pass. She understood that. She did not say so, but she understood it. He stayed 3 days. In retrospect, she would see those 3 days as a kind of sustained astonishment. The astonishment of finding that another person could fit into the spaces of a life you had designed entirely around their absence. He was not in the way. He was useful, which she appreciated more than poetry. He repaired the barn roof where 2 boards had split over the summer, restrung a stretch of fence along the north pasture, helped her move the cattle to the lower field where the grass was still good. He was not the kind of man who needed to be told twice or explained to at length. He looked at what needed doing and did it. In the evenings they sat on the porch and talked. She began to understand the shape of his history, not because he told it straight out, but because it existed in the spaces between what he said. She came to understand there had been a partner, a fellow lawman in Abilene, A man Phineas had considered his closest friend. A man who had turned out to be taking money from the very criminals they were supposed to be pursuing. Phineas had discovered it and had done what his sense of duty required, which was to report it, and the result had been a disaster of the kind that happens when powerful interests align against an inconvenient truth. His friend had connections Phineas had not known about. He had been discredited, dismissed, and his friend, remarkably, had survived the whole affair with minimal consequence. That had been 1877. He had been drifting since. "You could go back to law work," she said on the second evening. "Someone would take you." "I could," he agreed. "But you don't," she said. "Not yet," he said. The way he said it, with a slight emphasis on the last word, made her look at him more directly than she usually allowed herself to. On the third morning she found him at the barn before she was up, feeding the cattle, and she stood in the doorway of the barn watching him for a moment before he knew she was there. And she felt something she had been careful not to feel for 4 years, something that was not just attraction, though there was that, but something larger and more complicated, a recognition, the specific and terrifying recognition of a person who might, if she let them, matter to her. She went back inside and made breakfast and was very practical and direct for the rest of the morning. He saddled his horse after the noon meal on the third day. She stood on the porch and watched him prepare to leave the way she had stood on this porch and watched everything, with the stillness of a woman who had learned to endure departure. "I'll be passing through again," he said. He was on the horse now at the edge of the yard. "I know," she said. "Might stop again," he said. She looked at him steadily. "The light'll be on," she said, because it was true, and because she was a woman who did not make promises she would not keep, but she always kept the ones she made. He touched his hat and rode north, and she went inside and sat at her kitchen table for a while before she got up and did the afternoon's work, because sitting at the kitchen table was all she could manage for that particular interval. He came back in 2 weeks. He came back with a purpose that was visible in the way he rode, more directly, less like a man passing through and more like a man heading somewhere specific. He had spent 2 weeks doing some kind of carpentry work for a ranch operation 20 miles north, he said, and he had earned enough to resupply. He was going south, down toward San Antonio, to see about work he had heard mentioned. He stayed 4 days this time, and on the second evening he made her laugh, actually laugh for the first time in a very long time, with a story about a disagreement between a mule and a fence post that he had witnessed with great philosophical intensity. The laugh surprised her so much she put her hand over her mouth, and he watched her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she had to look away. "You don't do that often," he said. "Do what?" she said. "Laugh like that," he said. "Like you mean it." "I don't often have occasion," she said. "You should," he said. "It suits you." She changed the subject because there was a limit to how much directness she could handle in a single evening, and he allowed her to change it, but she noticed that his eyes stayed on her face a moment longer than the change of subject warranted. On the 4th day, before he left, he asked if he could write to her. She had been genuinely surprised by this, which itself surprised her, because she had been tracking the way this was developing with some care and she should have anticipated it. "Write to me," she repeated. "I'll be moving around," he said, "but there's a post office in every town worth the name. I can write. I don't know when the letters will arrive." "I know how mail works in this country," she said, which was a little sharp, and she immediately felt the sharpness and softened it. "Yes, you can write." He wrote from San Antonio, then from a town called Laredo that was doing rough business near the border and required a man with a steady nerve to work security for a freight operation, which was as close to law work as he had allowed himself in years. He wrote from a place called Del Rio and from a place called Bracketville. The letters were not long, but they were not short on substance. He wrote about what he observed, the land, the people, the particular quality of light in different parts of the territory. He asked questions about the farm and about her, real questions, questions that required actual answers, and she found herself at the kitchen table on winter evenings writing back with more of herself than she had intended. He told her things in letters that he had not quite managed to say in person. He told her about the specific weight of the betrayal in Abilene, the way it had not just ended a career but had ended a certain version of himself, a version that had believed in the fundamental decency of the systems he served. He told her he had spent a long time being angry and then a longer time being nothing in particular, which he thought was worse. She wrote back about Thomas, about the debt and the suspicious death and the sheriff she did not trust. She had never written any of this out before, had barely spoken it aloud, and there was something both frightening and relieving about sending it off in an envelope to a man who was 300 miles away in a town she had never been to. It felt safer than saying it face to face, and she wondered if that was a form of cowardice or simply a form of wisdom. He came back in February, when the winter was still mean and the roads were half frozen mud. He looked cold and tired, and she fed him a hot meal without ceremony and made up the narrow bed in the second room and did not make anything of it, and he slept for 14 hours and woke up looking more himself. They talked for 5 days with the frankness that the letters had made possible between them. He told her directly, sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee, that he thought about her when he was traveling. She looked at him across the table and said she thought about him too, and the admission cost her something, and she let him see that it cost her, and he nodded as if he understood the price. "I'm not settled," he said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," she said. "You've been clear about it. It wouldn't be fair," he said, "to come back here regular-like and take up your time and your hospitality if I don't have something more certain to offer." She looked at him steadily. "What are you trying to say, Phineas Warren?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. "I'm trying to say," he said, "that I think I need to decide something, and I wanted you to know that I'm thinking on it." "All right," she said. "You think on it." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. But it was the most honest and specific thing a man had said to her in 4 years, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure will survive. He left again in late February. He wrote from Laredo, where the freight work had resumed. He wrote from a town called Uvalde, where he had done 3 weeks of ranch handwork, which was solid, honest labor but not particularly interesting to him. He wrote less about the places and more about the thinking he was doing, the deciding, and she read those letters at her kitchen table and felt the future gathering itself somewhere out ahead of her like weather on the horizon, unmistakably approaching. In April, a man named Deke Calloway came to her farm. She knew who Deke Calloway was in the general sense that everyone in the county knew who he was, which was to say she knew he was the man who had been buying up land in the area, piece by piece, sometimes through legitimate purchase, and sometimes through methods that were murkier. He had an operation 15 miles west that had started as a cattle ranch, but had evolved into something more complex and less transparent, a kind of private business empire that had fingers in freighting and in the county politics, and in the rumors about various things that happened in the territory without official explanation. He was not the kind of man who came alone to visit a widow, so he brought 2 of his hands with him, which was itself a statement, a reminder of the resources behind whatever he was about to say. He was polite. He was very polite, in the deliberate way of men who want you to know they are choosing politeness out of many options. He sat in her kitchen and accepted the coffee she offered, because refusing would have been rude and he was being polite. And he told her he had heard she had been having difficulty keeping the farm going on her own, and he wanted her to know that he had a standing interest in buying the property if she ever found herself in a position where that made sense. She told him the farm was not for sale. He nodded as if he had expected this and was not discouraged by it. He said he understood, and that the offer stood, and that he hoped she would keep him in mind if her circumstances changed. After he left, she stood at her window and watched his party ride away, and felt the particular cold feeling that comes when you understand that something has been set in motion that is not going to resolve quickly or cleanly. She wrote to Phineas that same evening. She described the visit in careful detail, including the way Calloway had phrased things, the specific words he had used, the smile that never quite reached his eyes. She wrote that she was not frightened, which was partly true, and that she was handling it, which was also partly true. She wrote that she wanted him to know because he had become the person she told things to, which was true in a way that was no longer partly anything. His letter back arrived in 12 days, which was fast for the distance. He told her he knew the name Deke Calloway, that the name had come up during his time in Laredo in connection with some freight irregularities that had been investigated, but never prosecuted due to the investigator developing a sudden and convenient change of perspective. He told her to be careful. He told her he was coming back. He arrived on a Tuesday evening in late April, and he rode in at dusk with the purposeful, settled quality of a man who had finished deliberating about something. And he did not stop at the porch steps this time. He came right up onto the porch and stood there looking at her with those gray eyes, and without preamble he said, "I want to stay, Julia, if you'll have me." She had been waiting for this long enough that she might have been expected to respond quickly, but she did not, because what he was offering was large and real, and she wanted to meet it with appropriate weight. "What does that mean to you?" she said. "Staying." "It means exactly what it sounds like," he said. "It means I stop drifting. It means I'm here. It means I want to build something with you if you're willing to try. I'm a widow with 140 acres and 12 cattle and a very opinionated horse," she said. "I know what you are," he said. "I've been paying attention." She looked at him for a long moment, the last of the evening light doing something to the edges of things, making the yard and the barn and the road look like a painting of themselves. Then she said, "You'd better come inside and have supper," and the way she said it left nothing ambiguous, and the way he exhaled told her he had been holding his breath. He stayed. He found work in Redemption itself, which had a need for men with his background, not as a deputy exactly, since the sheriff's office was a complicated situation she would deal with separately, but as a kind of informal mediator and problem solver for the businesses in town, which was dignified enough and paid a wage. He worked the farm mornings and evenings and the town in between, and after 6 weeks of this arrangement he asked her directly if she would marry him. She said yes on the third asking, not because she needed convincing, but because she needed him to ask 3 times to understand that she was a woman who did not do things impulsively. And by the third asking he knew that, and he laughed a little when she said yes, a quiet, real laugh, and she felt it in her chest like warmth. They were married in June of 1883 by the Reverend Hatfield at the Redemption Church, with me Coulter as witness and me's son Daniel as the other. And Julia wore a blue dress she had made herself, and Phineas wore a clean shirt, and a jacket that me's son had lent him since they were of a similar build. And the whole thing was done in 20 minutes, which was the right length for 2 people who already knew what they were choosing and why. The trouble that had been gathering since Deke Calloway's visit did not announce itself before it arrived. It came in the form of a letter from the county seat in August, a legal notice that made Julia's blood go cold when she read it. The letter claimed that Thomas Barrett had taken on a debt of significant size in the spring of 1878, 3 months before his death, secured against the farm property. The debt had been assigned to a holding company, and the holding company was now calling it due. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and waited for Phineas to come home from town. She was very calm, the kind of calm that is indistinguishable from fury only if you know the person well. Phineas knew her well enough by then. He read the letter twice. He set it down carefully. He said, "This is Calloway." "Yes," she said. "The debt may not be real," he said. "It may not," she said. "But it's on paper and there's a signature that looks like Thomas's." "Forgery," he said. "That's what I think," she said, "but proving it is another matter." He was quiet for a moment thinking. Then he said, "I need to go to the county seat. There'll be records, the original filing, the notarization. If it was forged, there'll be inconsistencies." "And if the man who notarized it works for Calloway," she said. He looked at her. Then we need to find someone who doesn't, he said. It was not simple. Nothing about the next 3 months was simple. Phineas rode to the county seat twice and came back with information that was suggestive but not yet definitive. The signature on the debt document had inconsistencies that a trained eye could see, but that required a court to agree on. The notary was a man named Ferris who had notarized documents for Callaway's various enterprises on several occasions, which was not illegal but was indicative. Meanwhile, Callaway had clearly become aware that Phineas was investigating, because the pressure began to present itself in smaller ways first. One of Julia's cattle was found on the wrong side of a fence, drifted onto Callaway land, and Callaway's men took it as their right to impound it, which was technically within the law and technically a nuisance designed to create expense and difficulty. There was a fire in the field behind the barn, small and quickly managed, but deliberate, the circle of burning too precise to be accidental. Then came the night when Julia was alone because Phineas was in town for a late meeting with a lawyer he had retained, and 3 men came to her door. She did not open it. She got the Winchester and she stood at the window and she told them through the glass to get off her land. And after a long, tense exchange in which they said things designed to be frightening, and she responded in short sentences that were not frightened, they left. She told Phineas about it when he came home at midnight, and he went very still in the way that meant something was happening inside him that was not visible on his face. "That's escalation," he said. "Yes," she said. "We can't manage this quietly anymore," he said. "I know," she said. They went to see the county sheriff together the next morning, not the redemption sheriff who was a complicated situation, but the county sheriff who sat in Martindale 20 miles away. His name was Amos Webb, and he was a small, methodical man who had been doing the job for 11 years and had survived in the position by being both honest and politically careful, which was a difficult balance, and he wore it visibly in the lines around his eyes. He listened to everything they told him. He looked at the documents Phineas had gathered. He was quiet for a long time. "Callaway has resources," he said, "and he has friends in the district court." "I know," Phineas said. "But the evidence of forgery is real, and the intimidation is real. You've got a ranch wife being threatened in her own home." "What do you want me to do?" Webb asked, and the question was genuine, not evasive. "I want you to open an investigation into the debt filing," Phineas said. "I want it official and on record so that anything Callaway does after this point happens in the light." Webb thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "I can do that. It'll take time." "We'll manage the time," Phineas said. Things moved slowly and then suddenly. The investigation proceeded with the deliberate pace of legal process in a territory where the courts were overwhelmed and underfunded. Meanwhile, Callaway, who had apparently decided that the slower approach was not producing results, apparently decided to try something more direct. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Phineas had ridden out to the eastern quarter to check the creek crossing, which had been giving trouble after recent rains. He did not return by supper time, which was unusual. Julia kept the lamp burning and waited on the porch, which was when she heard horses on the road, and then saw, in the pool of lamplight, Phineas with his hands bound and 3 men on horseback around him, one of them with a gun to his head. And that was when she had screamed his name and raised the Winchester. "Ma'am," said the man with the black hat again, his voice harder now, "you got 1 rifle against 3 guns. You do the arithmetic." "I've done it," Julia said. She had positioned herself behind the heavy wooden porch post which gave her some cover. Her finger was on the trigger and her hands were not shaking. She was furious, which was clarifying. "And here is what I've concluded. I can drop you before any of your men clears leather. I was a farmer's wife for 6 years, and I have shot a great many things at greater distances than this. You want to test that?" The man was quiet. She could see him calculating. "What do you want?" she said. "The drifter needs to stop digging," said the man with the black hat. He did not say Callaway's name, which told her he was at least minimally careful. "He needs to take his wife and move along. The next town. The next county," Anywhere that is not here. This is my land, she said. My name is on the deed. My husband died on that road, and I believe I know who arranged it, and I intend to prove it. And this man here, she moved the rifle barrel to indicate Phineas without taking her eyes off the man with the black hat. He is staying too. Phineas, who had been watching all of this with the focused attention of a man who was trying to identify the exact right moment to act, chose that moment. He was bound at the wrists, not at the elbows. He had been working the knot loose since they had started arguing, and when the man with the black hat's attention was on Julia, he threw himself sideways off the horse with enough force to pull the gun barrel away from his temple, and he hit the ground and rolled. The shot went into the air. One of the other men drew, but Julia had already tracked to him and fired not to kill. She aimed for the shoulder, and the man grabbed his arm and his horse spooked. The third man, the one who had been hanging back, apparently decided that this was not the evening he was being paid for, and he wheeled his horse and rode fast in the direction he had come from. The man with the black hat steadied his horse, which was wild-eyed and trying to shy, and he looked at Julia, who had the Winchester leveled at him now with the calm certainty of a woman who has already made her decision and is simply waiting for the situation to require her to execute it. "This is not finished," he said. "I know," she said. "But tonight it is. Ride." He rode. The wounded man rode with him, bent over his saddle, and Julia kept the rifle up until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then she came off the porch and went to Phineas, who had gotten to his feet and was working the last of the rope from his wrists, and she stood in front of him and looked him over for damage. "You're all right," she said. "Scraped up some," he said. "Nothing serious." He looked at her. "You shot a man in the shoulder at 30 feet in the dark," he said. "I've done harder," she said. He looked at her for another moment, that same expression she had seen on his face when she screamed his name, the one she had been trying to name, and now she thought she had the name for it. It was the expression of a man who had found the thing he had not known he was looking for, and had now seen, with complete clarity, what he had almost lost before he had quite finished finding it. He put his arms around her and she let him, which was the correct and necessary response, and she stood in the dark in the lamplight from the porch and breathed carefully and felt his heartbeat under her hands, steady and real and present. "We have to end this," he said into her hair. "Yes," she said. "We do." The next morning Phineas rode to Martindale before dawn and was at Sheriff Webb's door when Webb came down for breakfast. Webb listened to his account of the previous evening's events with an expression that had moved from careful neutrality to something colder and more purposeful. "Attempted murder of a federal witness," Phineas said, "because that is what I am, as of last Tuesday. I filed a federal complaint against the debt fraud with the district federal office before I came home, which means last night's action was committed against a federal witness. That changes the jurisdiction." Webb looked at him. "You planned this," he said. "I planned for the possibility," Phineas said, "and the possibility arrived. The federal complaint changed everything. Federal jurisdiction meant Calloway's local connections provided much less insulation. A federal investigator arrived from San Antonio within the week. A careful, humorless man named Alcott, who read the forgery evidence with the exhaustive attention of someone who had made a career of exactly this kind of examination. He confirmed the forgery within 3 days. The notary Ferris, confronted with the forensic analysis, cracked with remarkable speed, offering a full account of his relationship with Calloway's enterprise in exchange for leniency. Calloway was arrested on the 12th of November, 1883. He was charged with fraud, forgery, conspiracy to intimidate witnesses, and the investigator added, on the strength of the evidence Ferris provided about the structure of Calloway's operations, and the testimony of 2 other individuals who emerged now that the situation had changed, a charge of conspiracy in connection with the death of Thomas Barrett 4 years prior. The redemption sheriff, the complicated situation Julia had been managing carefully for 4 years, resigned his office 1 week after Calloway's arrest, which told everyone in the county everything they needed to know about the nature of the complication. Julia sat in her kitchen, with the letter confirming the dismissal of the fraudulent debt claim in her hands, and she read it 3 times. Then she put it in the ledger beside Thomas's death certificate and her own deed, and she closed the ledger and sat for a moment in the November afternoon quiet of her kitchen. Phineas came in from the barn and looked at her face. "It's done," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table, which was a table she had carried on a wagon from her parents' house in Missouri when she was 19 years old, and which had existed in various kitchens as the solid, unmovable center of her domestic life, and at which she had sat alone for too many meals to count. "Thomas is at rest," she said. It was something she needed to say aloud. Phineas nodded. He understood about needing to say things aloud. "He is," he said. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, her work-roughened farmer's hands, and then she looked up at her husband, this man who had drifted past her life for 5 years and then had been pulled in by a lamp and had not left since. "What would you like to do next?" she asked. It was a real question. She meant it broadly. He thought about it in his honest, careful way. "I think," he said, "I would like to plant the east field in spring. I've been looking at it, and with the creek access you could get a better yield if you rotated what you're putting in, and I want to see about adding to the herd." She smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep, not the surprised laugh he had drawn from her in the early days, but something settled and certain. "That's practical," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. "You are," she said, "most of the time." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, those big, steady, capable hands that she had watched shoe a horse and fix a roof and grip a rope in the dark with the deliberate patience of a man who has decided that this is worth enduring. "I love you, Julia Barrett Warren," he said. She had known this for some time. She had known it the way you know things that are true at a depth where they cannot quite be said yet, where they require the right moment to surface. The right moment had been building since a Tuesday evening when a lamp burned on a porch and a man on a gray roan slowed his horse and stopped. "I love you," she said back. "Phineas Warren. I have loved you since before I had any business doing so." He smiled then, and it was not a small smile. It was the real thing, warm and whole, and transforming his face into something she felt was genuinely hers, something she got to keep. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one. Not easy. Winters in Central Texas were never easy, but good in the particular sense of a season spent close to someone you love, with enough work to justify the exhaustion and enough warmth to make the cold outside feel like a contrast rather than a threat. They developed the rhythms of a shared life, with the practical intimacy of 2 people who had both been alone long enough to know the value of what they were building. Me Coulter came by twice a week for coffee and was openly pleased with the situation, which she felt she had some credit in, having told Julia about Phineas years before, a contribution she regularly mentioned, and Julia regularly declined to fully endorse since Me had been diplomatically vague and had not actually encouraged anything. "You'd have figured it out without me," Me said. "I would have," Julia agreed, and Me laughed and refilled her cup. In the spring Julia found she was expecting, which she discovered on a morning in March, and spent the better part of an hour sitting very still in the bedroom, before she came out to breakfast and told Phineas in a direct and plain-spoken way. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man absorbing information of significant magnitude. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I'm surprised and I am all right." "I am also surprised," he said. "And I am also all right." He looked at her with something that was not quite managing to be contained in his expression. "Actually," he said, "I am considerably better than all right." She laughed. "The deep kind, the real kind." The East Field did indeed respond well to the rotation Phineas had planned, and the creek access proved as productive as he had predicted. And by summer they had expanded the herd modestly, and the farm had a feeling of forward motion that Julia had not allowed herself to believe in for a long time. Deke Calloway was tried in federal court in San Antonio in the fall of 1884. Julia and Phineas both attended to testify, staying in a boarding house near the courthouse for 4 days and attending the proceedings with the focused attention of people for whom this was not abstract. Calloway was convicted on the fraud and conspiracy charges. The conspiracy in connection with Thomas Barrett's death was harder to prove at the standard required, but the conviction on the other charges carried a sentence of 15 years, which was real consequence. Julia sat in the courtroom and listened to the verdict and felt something inside her that had been held in a specific shape for 6 years begin to release. Not happiness exactly, not in that moment, but something closer to the ending of an effort that had required constant internal maintenance, like a muscle that had been clenched so long it had forgotten how to rest. Phineas found her hand in the moment the verdict was read and held it, and she let him. They went home to Redemption in October with the trial behind them, and on the 14th of November, 1884, their son was born. He arrived in the early hours of a cold, clear morning, delivered by the town's capable doctor with me Coulter in attendance, and he announced his existence to the world with an authority that suggested he had opinions about it and intended to express them. They named him Thomas Phineas Warren, because the first name was owed to a man who had not been given justice while he lived but had been given it after, and the middle name was because the boy deserved to carry something of his father's, and because Julia liked the weight of it. Phineas held his son in the gray dawn light of the bedroom and looked at him with an expression so undone and open that Julia, exhausted and tender and watching from the pillow, thought she had never seen anything more purely itself. "He's very small," Phineas said. "He'll manage," Julia said. "He will," Phineas agreed, and the certainty in his voice, the deep and unperformative certainty, made her close her eyes for a moment out of sheer feeling. The Redemption sheriff's vacancy had been filled by a man named Harlow who came down from Abilene, and this produced in Phineas a brief and visible flicker of something complicated. He did not talk about it immediately, but Julia had learned to read his silences, and she did not press. She simply let the silence sit until it was ready to become words. He told her one evening in December, Thomas asleep in the crib beside the bed and the fire burning, that Harlow had spoken to him about taking on a deputy's role. Not as a favor, as an appointment based on his record and his demonstrated capability and his knowledge of the county and its issues, which were genuinely considerable by now. "What did you tell him?" Julia asked. "I told him I'd think about it," Phineas said. "And," she said, "and I've been thinking about it," he said. She considered him in the firelight. She thought about what me had said years ago, that he had been a lawman once before things went wrong. She thought about the quality of attention he brought to problems of justice and order and accountability. She thought about what a man does with the part of himself that was built for something specific. "I think you should do it," she said. He looked at her. "It could bring its own complications," he said. "Phineas," she said, "you rode into a room of 3 armed men for me. You went to a federal office on your own initiative to build a case against a man who was trying to take everything I had. You are built for this kind of work. Sitting it out to avoid complications is not something I'm asking of you." He was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. He became deputy sheriff of Redemption County in January of 1885. He was good at it, which surprised no one who had paid attention, including Julia, who had been paying close attention since a Tuesday evening when he came up her porch steps for the first time. He had a way of handling difficult situations that minimized violence without appearing to avoid it, a combination of physical presence and rational directness that most people found more convincing than confrontation would have been. The years that followed had the texture of a life being genuinely lived. They were not without difficulty, because frontier life in the 1880s did not become easy simply because you resolved your most pressing crisis. And there was always work, always weather, always the particular grinding demand of the land and the cattle and the seasons. But the difficulty had a different quality than the years before, because it was shared, because there were two sets of hands for every problem and two minds for every decision and two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what choosing meant. Thomas grew from a small, opinionated infant into a curious, sturdy boy who adored horses in general and Franklin in particular, and who displayed from a very early age his father's quality of stillness and his mother's quality of directness, which was a combination that the people of redemption found either reassuring or slightly alarming, depending on their relationship with honesty. In the spring of 1887, Julia found she was expecting again, and this one she managed with more equanimity than the first, being more accustomed now to the way her body conducted these proceedings. A daughter arrived in September, in a manner rather more dramatic than her brother's arrival had been, and she was named Clara Me Warren, me being for me Coulter, who had been present at both births and who wept very productively at the naming, and then denied having wept at all. Phineas was promoted to sheriff of Redemption County in 1888, when Harlow retired to go live with his daughter in Fort Worth. There was a town meeting about it, which was how things were done in Redemption, and the vote was not close. He accepted the position with the understated matter-of-factness of a man who has been working towards something without letting himself name it, and has now arrived without quite having charted the destination. Julia attended the swearing-in, Thomas standing beside her trying very hard to hold still, Clara on her hip because Clara at 1 year old had no interest in stillness or in being set down, and she watched Phineas Warren take the oath of office in the Redemption Town Hall with his hand on the Bible, and his gray eyes level and his voice steady. And she thought about a drifter on a gray roan who had passed her road for 5 years without stopping until a lamp pulled him in. And she thought about what a thing it was, the pivot of a life, how it could rest on something as simple as light. That evening he came home to the farm, which was their farm now in every sense, expanded to 160 acres after they had purchased the adjoining parcel from a family relocating to Oklahoma Territory. And he came through the door, and she had supper waiting, and Thomas was at the table with his homework from the schoolhouse, and Clara was in her high chair being very vocal about her opinions regarding the current situation. And Phineas stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment and simply looked at all of it. She was watching him. She saw what happened in his face. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet. It was the face of a man who had traveled a very long road to a specific place and had arrived so completely that the traveling had finally, fully stopped. "Sheriff Warren," she said, not mockingly, warmly, trying the new shape of it. "Mrs. Warren," he said back, equally warm. Thomas looked up from his homework. "Does that mean people have to do what you say now?" he said to his father with the practical curiosity of a 4-year-old engaging with the nature of authority. "People have to do what is right," Phineas said, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "The sheriff's job is just to remind them when they forget." "What if they don't want to remember?" Thomas asked. "Then the sheriff is persistent about it," Phineas said. Julia put a plate in front of him, and he caught her hand briefly as she released it. Just a touch, just a second, but full of the accumulated weight of everything. And she let herself feel all of it without managing it or containing it or converting it into something smaller and safer. She just let it be what it was. Clara threw a piece of bread from her high chair to express her view on the general proceedings, and the moment opened into the ordinary evening of a family at supper, which was the best kind of moment there was. Phineas Warren served as sheriff of Redemption County for 9 years, and in that time the county changed, and the town changed, and the territory became a state in 1890, when Texas had been a state for decades. But the region's internal political landscape shifted in ways that made his office both more and less complicated at different times. And through all of it, he served with the same quality of steady, principled attention he brought to everything. He was, Julia sometimes thought when she watched him move through the world, the most genuinely good man she had ever known, and she meant that not as a simple compliment but as a specific description. Not a perfect man, he had his stubbornness and his silences, and his tendency to think he could manage things alone when asking for help would be both faster and more sensible. And they had arguments about this, real arguments, the kind that require the night to sleep on and the morning to resolve. And they resolved them every time, because they had both come to this too slowly and too honestly to let it be undone by the ordinary friction of two strong-willed people occupying the same life. Franklin the horse died in the spring of 1889, which was a genuinely mourned event in the Barrett Warren household. He was 24 years old and had been opinionated right up to the end, and Thomas cried more than he would later admit to, and Phineas built a proper marker for him at the edge of the east field, because it seemed the right thing to do, and Julia agreed. They got a new horse the following month, a young bay mare of considerable energy and uncertain judgment, who Thomas named Duchess with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old who has done the correct thing. And Duchess proved over time to be a worthy successor to Franklin in all the ways that mattered. Coulter lived to be 73 and remained the most well-informed person in Redemption County until the very end, which was in the winter of 1893, and her funeral was attended by what felt like half the county because she had touched so many lives in so many practical ways over so many decades, and the loss of her was both specific and widespread. Julia delivered the eulogy and said true things about her with the clarity and precision that me had always appreciated in their friendship, and the congregation nodded because everything Julia said was exactly right. The children grew. Thomas at 10 was already showing the makings of a person who would do something principled and demanding with his life, and at 12 he had decided it was law, which made Phineas both proud and carefully thoughtful about the realities of that profession. Clara at 7 was making everyone around her keep pace with a mind that moved very fast and had no patience for imprecision, and her teacher at the schoolhouse had written to Julia that Clara was the most capable student she had encountered in 15 years of teaching, which Julia had read aloud to Phineas over breakfast with quiet pride. There was a third child in 1893, a boy they named James, because they liked the simple solidity of it, and because both of them had been carrying the name in the back of their minds since before they knew why. And James arrived with considerably less fanfare than either of his siblings had generated and settled into the household, with an ease that suggested he had decided it was exactly where he intended to be. The farm was prospering by the mid-1890s, in a way that would have been unimaginable to the 26-year-old widow, who had gripped its management with both hands and her teeth, and her sheer refusal to surrender it. They had extended the herd to 40 cattle, added a small apple orchard on the north slope that had been Phineas's idea, and had taken 5 years to begin producing, and was now, in the autumn of 1896, producing enough to sell at the Redemption Market every fall. The farm hands they had taken on over the years, 2 young men from the area who needed steady work and proved to be reliable and capable, had become fixtures of the operation. Julia kept the ledger. She had always kept the ledger and always would, and the ledger was now 3 volumes because the original had been filled, and a second and a third had followed it, and the progression from the desperate, careful accounting of a widow protecting herself to the confident, detailed records of a thriving operation was itself a document of everything this life had been and become. She still burned the porch lamp. Every evening from dusk until she went inside, the lamp burned. It was habit and it was ritual, and it was something she had never stopped and did not intend to. Phineas noticed this and never commented on it directly, but sometimes on a summer evening when they were both on the porch, he would look at the lamp with a particular expression, and she would look at him looking at it, and they would not say anything because they did not need to. Some things are said completely by the fact of their continuing. In the autumn of 1897, a young man came through redemption who reminded Julia so precisely of Phineas as she had imagined him at 25 that she nearly said something, and did not, but mentioned it to Phineas that evening, and Phineas looked at her over the kitchen table and said, "Was he kind?" "He seemed to be," she said. "Was he passing through or staying?" Phineas asked. "Passing through," she said. Phineas was quiet for a moment. "Some things have to be ready before they can stop," he said. She thought about 5 years of a rider on a gray roan. She thought about a lamp. She thought about readiness and timing and the particular things that call a person in from their traveling. "Yes," she said, "they do." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand, which she had been giving him across tables for 14 years by then, and the gesture had not worn smooth. It had worn deep, the way good things do with use. They were, she thought, one of those stories that does not have a dramatic single peak, but rather a shape that builds and then levels out into something better than the peak would have been. A plateau of good, solid, real daily happiness that is quieter than the stories people tell but more sustaining than anything a story can fully contain. Thomas Warren left for law school in Austin in 1900. He was 16 and ready in every way that mattered, and the morning he rode out, Julia stood on the porch with Clara beside her and James holding her hand, and she watched him go with the specific mix of pride and loss that is the interior life of a parent watching a child become their full self at the cost of their proximity. Phineas stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. "He'll do well," he said. "I know," she said. "And he'll come back," he said. "I know that too," she said, and she did, because Thomas was his father's son in this. He knew how to leave and he knew how to come home, and the two things together make a whole person. Clara at 13 was showing every sign of becoming someone who would require a very large stage, and Julia was already in correspondence with the school in San Antonio that several people had mentioned as being exceptional for girls of particular ability. This was not a common path in 1900 in Central Texas, but Julia Barrett Warren was not a woman who was stopped by the uncommon, and she had raised a daughter in that tradition. James at 7 was the quietest of the three, which in a family of strong personalities was not a disadvantage but a gift, and he had Phineas's quality of stillness and his own particular quality of deep attention to growing things, to the apple orchard and the kitchen garden and the cattle, and Julia thought that this one would stay close to the land, and there was something deeply right about that, about a child who would carry forward the place that she had fought so hard to keep. The year 1900 turned into 1901, and then 1902, the seasons marking themselves in the way of a life that has found its pattern and moves in it with comfort rather than tedium. On a September evening in 1902, Julia sat on the porch after supper in the warmth of the early fall, mending in her lap, the lamp burning on its hook, and she heard the road the way she had always heard the road, with a part of her attention that never quite turned off. A rider went past, heading north, and she looked up out of habit, and the rider was young, maybe 20, moving with the specific quality of someone who is not going somewhere so much as going, and she watched him until he was out of the lamplight, and she thought, as she sometimes did, about what it was that made a person stop. It was not always a lamp. It was not always visible, the thing that pulled you in. Sometimes it was a letter that said the true thing. Sometimes it was a question asked in a direct and unashamed way. Sometimes it was a laugh that came from somewhere real. Sometimes it was someone who simply waited without condition for you to be ready. But sometimes it was a lamp. Something small and constant and burning, because someone decided to keep it burning even when they did not know why, even when hope was a word they had set aside, even when the road outside had been empty for so long that the light seemed to serve no practical purpose at all. Phineas came out onto the porch and sat in his chair beside hers, because they had 2 chairs now. They had had 2 chairs for a long time, and the chairs were as settled into their position as everything else. He looked at her in the lamplight, the way he still looked at her after almost 20 years, with the direct, unguarded quality of a man who had no interest in pretending to feel less than he felt. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at the road, empty and dark beyond the circle of the lamp. "I was thinking about the night you stopped," she said. "Which night?" He said with a slight smile because there had been several meaningful nights in the history of them, and he knew which one she meant, but he liked hearing her say it. "The first one," she said, "when you came off the road." "The light," he said. "The light," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "I had been past here 100 times," he said, "maybe more." "I know," she said. "I counted." He laughed. The good laugh, the real one she had earned the right to call out of him. "You did not count," he said. "Not precisely," she admitted, "but approximately." He reached across and found her hand and held it in the autumn evening, and the lamp burned on its hook, and the road was quiet, and inside the house James was asleep, and Clara was reading, and on a shelf in the front room were 2 framed photographs, one of Thomas in Austin that he had sent for his birthday, and one of Clara and James taken at the Redemption Market day earlier that summer, and the ledger was on the kitchen table where Julia had left it open to the current page, full of numbers that added up to a life that had been built against resistance and was all the more solid for it. "Do you ever wish you had stopped sooner?" she said. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything that mattered. "No," he said. "Not exactly. I think I had to be who I was when I stopped, not who I was before." She understood that. She was 30 now, she had been 30 when he stopped, and she had been exactly who she needed to be to recognize what he was and not flinch from it. Younger Julia would have been frightened or cautious, or would have managed herself out of feeling what she felt. The woman who had survived 4 years alone and kept a lamp burning for reasons she could not entirely explain had been precisely ready. "I'm glad you stopped," she said. "Julia," he said, and the way he said her name, the weight he had always given it, the specific gravity of it in his voice, was the same as it had been the first time he said it. The evening on the porch steps with the coffee. "I am Phineas Warren, I know, Julia Barrett." And the name in his mouth had been different than the name in anyone else's, and it still was. "I am profoundly glad I stopped," he said. The lamp burned. The autumn evening moved around them with its particular smell of grass and dry earth and coming cold. The house behind them was warm and full, and theirs, genuinely, completely, legally and emotionally, and in every material and immaterial sense that the word could hold. The farm stretched out in the dark, the east field and the orchard and the cattle grazing in the south pasture, and the creek running softly in its channel on the eastern quarter, and all of it was sound and solid and real. Phineas Warren, who had drifted for years and had found that the drifting had not been wasted, because it had made him exactly who he needed to be when a lamp finally called him in, sat on his porch beside his wife, and felt something he had almost not believed he was going to be allowed to feel: the deep, stable, undemanding contentment of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Julia Barrett Warren, who had kept a light burning in the dark without knowing why, who had fought for her land and her life and her right to occupy them on her own terms, who had waited with the patience of the land itself, and then had chosen with the decisiveness of a woman who knows her own mind, sat beside him and felt the truth of the life they had made settle over her like the last warmth of the evening sun, quiet and golden and good. The road ran past, as it always had, and the lamp burned as it always did, and the night came on in the way of all nights in that country, slowly and then fully, and the two of them remained on the porch in the lamplight until the stars were well established and the coyotes had started their conversation in the far hills. And then they went inside together, and Julia turned the lamp down but did not put it out. She never put it out, just turned it low, and in the morning she would turn it up again. That was how it had always been. That was how it would continue to be, a light in the dark, a road that ran past, the specific, irreplaceable daily fact of each other, home.